We are going to be talking about what I like to call first world problems.
First world problems.
Yes.
All right, let's go for it.
Okay, question one. Why do you think that there are jobs that we think are specific to the first world and jobs that are common and acceptable for everyone in the third world?
Give me an example.
First world job, lawyer, doctor, therapist. Third world jobs, construction, bricklayer, electrician.
Oh,
And electrician is even the better end of the deal.
So, historically, in the South African context, right? So, I don't know if it's a first world versus third world problem as much as it is a very, very South African state of affairs. In the early 1900s, there was a specific regulation passed called the Bantu Workers Act. And what the Bantu Workers Act said, and I obviously paraphrase because I don't remember all the details, but essentially certain jobs were reserved for white people in the country, and other jobs were reserved for other races. So there was some sort of defined hierarchy that was legislated, and for example, only white people were allowed to be employed into like management positions and supervisory positions, and typically in positions that required some sort of professional certification or a university education. Right. The Bantu Workers Act then influenced the rest of the economy or the rest of society in that way, in that certain courses at university or certain universities were reserved for certain categories of people, and didn't make any sense for like black people to study certain subjects because they would never be able to be employed in those roles anyway. So it was sort of this structured exclusionary practice that happened across the South African economy. But the interesting thing that's happened is that those sort of exclusionary practices are embedded in our collective psyche, right? Because of this historic reality, our parents want something better for us. And what that better means is like a university education and then what you would call a first world career. And the importance the relevance, the opportunity in what you consider third world careers is not being acknowledged by our collective society, because those roles were typically reserved for people who were deemed of a lower status economically. So again, it's not so much, I think, as a first world versus third world issue as much as it is a societal mindset. And the great travesty of the societal mindset right now is that in the South African context we have a significant number of unemployed graduates, and we have a significant skills shortage in what is considered the vocational trades. So exactly as you said, construction, bricklaying, plastering, painting, tiling, I mean, everybody will tell you that there's a skill shortage in all of those areas. There's a shortage of electricians, there's a shortage of plumbers, welders, I could go on and on and on. But in all the vocational trades, we essentially have a skill shortage in this country.
Okay, and then speaking on the disparity we see between the jobs needed and then the people willing to do those jobs, right? What are the effects of so many people vouching for these upper class jobs? Because we had a discussion the other day and you said that we don't need lawyers, and yet everyone's starting to be a lawyer. So as a country, where are we going to find ourselves should this situation continue? And then how do we start to make a U-turn from this situation?
How do we start to make a U-turn from situations? It's very fascinating. So what's happening, and this is not just in South Africa, this is across the world, is that the education system and the advice that young people are being given hasn't evolved with time, right? But unfortunately, the economy has evolved very rapidly. So the good advice that teachers were giving students 20, 30 years ago doesn't necessarily apply in today's economy, but that advice is still being given. So which is kind of the first problem. I think that there needs to be wide-scale awareness of this shifting world of work and shifting economic mechanisms that enable the trade of labor for money, which is what essentially work is, right? And that trade of labor for money doesn't necessarily look like a permanent job anymore. There's lots of different varieties and variables now associated with how we can earn money based on our skills. So widespread education awareness around what those different types of opportunities look like. But also, I mean, as much as there's like an economic situation happening, there's also a social dynamic that we need to address. Many young people, especially in South Africa, that are in the position to enter the labor market now come from households where the parents and the generations before them didn't have the opportunity to go to university and study and become a professional. So that is like a collective ambition of the family, right? That is laid on the shoulders of the young person who now has this opportunity. Because historically, in the past, in generations before us, earning that qualification and getting entry into that profession was your ticket like into the middle class. It's not being acknowledged inside those family units that the certification, the degree, that entry into a professional life is no longer a ticket into the middle class. So that mindset shift needs to happen collectively at a societal household level as well. And parents, and it's difficult for me to say as a parent, but parents need to re-evaluate the hopes and dreams that they have for their children, because those hopes and dreams influence the advice and the discipline that they instill in those kids. And the advice and the discipline the advice that was given to us, the parents, and the discipline that was instilled in us as the parents do not necessarily apply in the current context for young people in the economy.
I was asking the past two questions, and the reason I bring up this topic is because South Africa has like an entire culture, it seems, of informal businesses and street vendors. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about them and their situation. My first question is, are they entrepreneurs? What is the difference between them, the street vendors, and entrepreneurs, if any at all?
That is such an interesting question. So I'm going to take it back a little bit. What we as South Africans, or as Africans, or anybody that works and lives in what is considered a developing economy, and not any developing economy, but specifically developing economies that were colonized and that have abundant like natural resources like we do, so mineral resources and things where that instills a mining industry. So in developing economies like ours, an interesting thing has happened in terms of economic theory, right? So economic theories as we know them were generally formalized in what we consider the global north, right? So, and what's interesting about those economic theories is that the wealth that was created in the global north was as a result of extraction in somewhere else. So the conversations around the British wealth is based on mining activity in Africa that then resulted in wealth creation for British people, the British shareholders of those mining companies, for example, right? So these premises of economic growth and economic modeling and economic theories is based on a fundamental philosophy of I will take from somewhere else and I will create wealth here. And therein we have a formal economic model. We take a raw material and we add value to it. That's the premise. What's happened in our economy is that the raw materials were removed, right? We weren't necessarily given the opportunity to add value to our own raw materials. And so our economies evolved in a different way. And our economies evolved in a way that the economic theory does not apply to, because the theory assumes that we will be able to access raw materials. So that's the first fundamental flaw in kind of the mechanisms that exist right now. The second sort of flaw is that the current economic theories assume that anybody will be able to take ownership of property. It's called the theory of the commons. You generate a wealth base by being able to acquire property. And we know that that's not the reality on this continent or any other continent that has been or any other country that has been colonized, because property rights were assumed by somebody else. Right, so another flaw in the economy. And then the third thing I want to say is that in these sort of developing economies where the formal economic theory does not necessarily apply, that doesn't mean that economic models have not applied, because Africans and Indians and South Americans and Australians had a mechanism of trade long before any colonists landed on the shores. Right? The difference is that that mechanism of trade and economy has never really been documented or validated in sort of the global academic world around what, or by the people that decide what economic modeling or theory should be. Right? So in South Africa, in this like very dichotomous economy, we can visually see the difference between what is considered formal, sort of global north kind of economic modeling, which you see in the center of Joburg, in the central business districts, and everybody going about their business in a very, very formal, organized way, or what seems to be a formal, organized way. And then you have these concepts of township economics and, rural economics and socioeconomic theories. And I mean, we can throw around lots of English words that don't quite articulate what it means, or don't quite articulate or illustrate a very traditional African economic system, which do still exist. And those economic systems that exist in Africa that predate any modern economic theory are rooted in the principles of humanity, sharing togetherness, and like strength and unity, right? Which means that you can have informal traders, is what we call them, sitting next to each other on a pavement selling exactly the same thing. And just by some sort of collective wisdom, all three traders go home every night and they've all made similar amounts of money, right? Because collectively we share, collectively we recognize each other as human, and collectively we'd rather collaborate than compete. And that's the foundations of like sort of African economic theory, traditional economic theory on the African continent, but unfortunately hasn't been documented.
I wanted to ask about economic theory. Right? And how there is economic theory that was developed from the global north and what may have already existed here. Do you think that in places like South Africa, where we've been colonized but we still maintain our own traditional values like Ubuntu, which is what you were speaking about, do you think that they they clash in places like South Africa that have been colonized but still want to maintain our way of thinking, but we are still influenced by other people's way of thinking.
So I think that the problem we have in South Africa is that we think one is better than the other. Right. I think that the merits and the power and the sort of merit and power of traditional economic systems in South Africa is not valued by society. For whatever reason, everybody's clamoring to get into what is called the formal economy. Right. Which is also why we have this growing dependency on social development and social grants in the country, because not everybody can get into the formal economy. The formal economy has not been designed to accommodate everybody. It's just the unfortunate truth of the matter. So if we are going to be an independent and productive society, we have to embrace the traditional economy as well, and acknowledge those mechanisms that will enable our productivity going forward. But we don't, because everybody still sort of has glamorized, I think is the word, glamorized the formal economy, and everybody's now trying to get their crumbs of this little pie. So yes, I do think that it's in conflict. And I mean, you speak about Ubuntu, and the question I go to bed with like almost every day is that, does it still exist in practice? Especially for those of us that have made it into the formal economy.
Wow. Do the amounts of informal businesses that we have, and street vendors specifically, do they have any effect on our economy?
Of course they do. So, I mean, what is the economy, in your opinion?
The economy is the government that runs it and the people that live in it. So the businesses and how they affect the government. So it's everyone and how they affect the government and vice versa.
So you'd be interested to know that theoretically anyway, the government has very little to do with the economy. The economy is essentially where goods and services are traded in order to meet the needs of individuals and individual households. The entire premise of economics is serving human needs. Right. So does the street vendor who is selling her wares in order to pay for food and pay for clothes her kids, is she impacting the economy? Of course she is, because she's found a way to serve her needs.
There is a article I was reading, and I want to ask a couple of questions from the article, which was, the article was speaking about an informal sector. Do only third world countries have informal sectors? Or do you think everybody should have an informal sector?
I don't know if everybody should have an informal sector. I don't know if only third world countries have informal sectors. I know that a lot of economies have informal traders. And essentially what is an informal trader that participates in the informal sector is somebody that's conducting a business that doesn't necessarily require a specific type of business registration or a specific type of licensing or a bank account, right? And so if you can, in conducting your trading activity, skirt around those three kind of formalization activities, then you're operating in the informal sector. There's one very significant profession that typically falls outside the formal economy in most countries, and that is sex trade outside the formal economy. In most economies, in some very progressive economies, it's become formalized. But what does formalization do?
Restricts to a degree.
What formalization does to an economic sector is that it imposes regulations, which typically adds expenses. It also enables tax collection, which reduces profits. Right. For most informal traders, especially in a South African context, they don't make enough money to add to their expense base or to increase their operating expenses or to pay taxes anyway. So there's no benefit to anybody for formalizing it.